In this lesson, we're going to learn the basics of modifying our terrain. Now, let's go to our terrain editor, and you'll see right here we have import. So I'm going to click import, and I'm going to find the file here, and this is going to be in your project folder. So in your project files, you'll see referenced files folder, and in that you're going to see heightmap.bmp. So let's just import this and see what happens. So we're going to hit open, and you'll see that it imports that bump map, that height map that we've created. Now let's take a look at what it looks like in our scene. So here, for taking a look at this, it looks like we have our terrain and we have no water. It's actually going down into the level here, so it's kind of like we're surrounded by mountains at this point. Okay, so we could hit Control G and we could begin to run around in this level, and it works just as normal. Let's hit escape and let's open up our terrain editor and let's see what we've actually done here. You'll see that the black and white values have actually switched. Well, inside of our terrain editor we can actually invert our height maps. So if we click invert, you'll see that we have that same terrain that we had before. Okay. Now if we hit invert again, it's basically just going to switch those black and white values. This is a good way to make terrain that is supposed to be surrounded by mountains rather than surrounded by water. All right. Now if we're going to create a level like this, and this is what we're going for, we're not necessarily needing any oceans or anything like that. So it would be a good idea to go ahead and save some memory by turning the water off. So to do that, we go to terrain, and then we go to modify, and we'll remove water. We'll hit OK, and if we remove and we go up to over our map here, we'll look down and we'll see that there's no water any longer. Okay. Alright, so now we've imported a height map, and we are ready to learn how to modify this into exactly what we want. We're getting into sculpting our terrain. So let's take a look at our blocking tools or our brush settings in order to start sculpting our terrain. Now at this point we're not going to get in and start sculpting that layout just yet. We're just going to learn the tools first. So to begin with our terrain tools, let's go to our terrain panel, and you'll see that we have modify. Now modify is going to bring up our modify terrain rollout with our brush settings, and we have 4 different brush settings here. We have flatten, smooth, rise and lower, and pick height. Now flatten obviously is going to flatten our terrain at a specific height that we've chosen. So under flatten you'll see that height is set to a default value of 100. So let's drop this down to around 50. Now you'll see as I'm hovering over my terrain I have a green circle which is going to stay snapped to the terrain, and then we have a yellow circle which is going to tell us where this terrain is going to flatten to. So this is actually going to bring my terrain up in this area and flatten it out up to that yellow point. So if I click and hold, you'll see here that that terrain has been raised into kind of like a plateau sort of fashion. I'm going to hit Control Z one time just to turn that off or get rid of that change that we've made. So you can see how flatten works in that sense. Now with flatten we have some settings here. We have outer radius and inner radius or inside radius, and this is going to give us a different effect on our brush. So right now you can see that this is a very hard brush. As we begin to sculpt, you'll see that we get a lot of creases right in here. So to smooth that out we can adjust our outside radius and our inside radius. So to make it smoother we need our outside radius to be larger than our inside radius. And normally if I want something to be really smooth, I like to have a ratio of about 10 to 1 on our outside radius. So I'll go 40 on my outside radius, and then I'm going to do 4 on my inside radius. So that's what I mean by that. Now we could get away with dropping the outside radius a little bit more. Let's go to about 20. And let's do 20, not 200. And drop our inside radius to 2. And this is a good size on our brush. And we could be a little lenient with the outside radius. We could drop it just a little bit more if we wanted. and begin to sculpt, and you'll see how that's much smoother than what we had before. So the further apart our outside radius is from our inside radius, the smoother we're going to get. Now obviously we can't drop our inside radius down to 1 and then our outside radius up to 200 because that's a very large brush. If we step back, we'll be brushing over this entire object here. Alright, so let's hit Control Z just to get rid of that smoothing that we've done there, or that flatten. And let's drop our outside radius to something a little more manageable. And our inside, and that's fine. Now we have hardness. And hardness is going to determine kind of like the strength of the brush. So if I take my hardness down to 0 and I start to sculpt on this, you'll notice that nothing's happening. If I take my hardness up to 1, you'll see that it's a very hard edge here. Okay, very, very tough. All right. So we can drop this down, and I normally like to stay around the 0.2 default value whenever I'm working with this. Very rarely will I adjust my hardness when using flatten. Now obviously our height is going to be the height in which it's going to flatten. Now we can adjust that height by using our slider, or we could use pick height to pick a height inside of our terrain. So all I have to do is just click right on my terrain, and you'll see that that value changes there. Pick it a little bit lower, and that changes even more. Now with the flatten brush activated, we could actually pick our height a little bit easier than just using that pick height button. We could actually hold down Control, and you'll see that we get that pick height icon, and we could still go ahead and choose that, and it saves that value here. Okay, so I can go even higher, and you'll see how that is changing. Now with flatten, we've talked about that, the major settings here, but now we're into noise settings, and this is just kind of an add-on or an additive type feature to where it adds a little bit of noise to your brush effect. Now with flatten, the noise can work, but we need to make sure that we tweak it just enough. Let's go ahead and add this. Let's pick a height that's not quite so high there, and let's begin to flatten. And you'll see that it's not really flattening out at all. It's really coming up to a point of the flatten and then adding kind of this noise on top of it. So like I said, that's an additive type feature. Now normally the noise settings I like to use with the rise and lower. So let's talk about that next. Now I just hit Control Z to undo that flatten. Now you could also click on undo up here as well. So let's move on to the rise lower brush. Now you'll see that rise and lower has the same options as the flatten tool. So we have outside, inside radius, we have hardness, and then we have height. Okay. Now height works a little bit differently. We could either rise or lower. So if we want to rise, we need to make sure that we're in the positive values. If we want to lower, we need to make sure that we are in the negative values. So let's adjust our outside radius, and we're going to adjust our inside radius a little bit. And I'm just going to begin to drag in. You'll see how that adds in and begins to rise our terrain straight up from where it's at. We could continue to paint on that, and it would rise infinitely until we've reached our max height that we set, which is 128. Let's hit Control Z one time, and let's talk about the noise settings. So the noise setting with this, again, is going to rise it up, but it's also going to add a little bit of a random bumpiness or a random noise feature to this. So you can see how that works there. Now whenever you're using that noise setting, you may actually want to lower this, and whenever you try to lower it, it's going to rise certain parts of it, and it may seem like it's going in the opposite direction. Now what you need to remember is that whenever we set a height, it's going to lower it down that far whenever we hold it down. But whenever we add our noise setting, it's going to add that back. So we need to make sure that we are setting our height low enough that it actually pushes into the ground. So you can see that some of it goes in and then some begins to rise. So that can be a little confusing at first, but once you get the hang of how the noise setting actually works there, along with your height, it becomes a little bit easier. Now the final tool that we want to talk about is smooth. Now smooth is very simple. It has an outside radius and that's it. And we can begin to smooth out any of our terrain. Now smooth can be used under the flatten tool as well, and you can just hold down shift and that will smooth, and you can see how it switches over to that tool. Same thing for rise and lower. If you're working with this tool and you hold down shift, it's going to go to your smooth tool. Alright, so we've talked about the basics of these brush settings, and in our next lesson we're going to start blocking out our terrain into our major forms. So I'll see you then.